Watch what happens when pressure rises. Most people collapse mentally long before circumstances force them to. They face a deadline and their thinking scatters. They encounter conflict and their judgment clouds. They experience stakes rising and their clarity vanishes, not because the pressure is too great, but because they never train their minds to remain steady when everything around them accelerates. They spent their lives thinking clearly only when conditions were comfortable, when stakes were low, when time was abundant, when emotions were calm. And the moment any of these changed, their ability to think clearly disappeared, because clarity under pressure is not automatic. It's not natural. It's trained deliberately, systematically, through conditioning that most people never undertake. This is why some people thrive when pressure increases while others crumble. Not because they're smarter, not because they have better circumstances, but because they possess a skill that can be learned but rarely is. The skill of maintaining absolute mental clarity when every external force is demanding that you panic, when urgency screams at you, when fear whispers doubt, when chaos surrounds you. The trained mind remains calm, focused, clear, making decisions with the same precision at peak pressure that others can only manage in perfect peace. This is not a personality trait. This is not something you're born with or without. This is a capacity, a mental discipline, a skill that can be developed to such a degree that pressure, instead of weakening you, reveals your strength. Today, you're going to learn exactly how this skill is built, not through theory or philosophy, but through practical understanding of what happens in your mind under pressure and how to maintain control when most people lose it. Because the difference between those who succeed in high-stakes situations and those who fail is not talent or resources. It's mental clarity, the capacity to think straight when everything suggests you should panic. And once you understand how to cultivate this capacity, how to condition your mind to remain steady regardless of external pressure, you gain an advantage that compounds across every area of your life. In leadership, in competition, in conflict, in crisis, in any moment when clarity matters most and is hardest to maintain. But first, you must understand what pressure actually is. Not the external circumstances, but what happens internally when you experience pressure. Because pressure itself is neutral. It's just circumstances with stakes attached. What makes pressure feel overwhelming is not the circumstances. It's your mental response to the circumstances. The thoughts you think, the emotions you allow, the stories you tell yourself about what's happening. This internal response, this is what creates the experience of pressure. And this is what you must learn to control. When pressure rises, several things happen automatically in most people's minds. First, time perception distorts. Everything feels urgent, rushed, like there's not enough time. This perception triggers stress response. Your body floods with hormones designed for physical threat. But you're not facing physical threat. You're facing mental challenge. So these hormones, instead of helping hinder, they accelerate your thinking, make you feel like you must act immediately, must decide now, must move fast. And this acceleration destroys clarity, because clear thinking requires calm, requires the ability to consider carefully, to see accurately, to judge wisely, all of which become impossible when your mind is racing. Second, not necessarily fear of physical harm, but fear of outcome, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of loss. This fear colors everything you perceive, makes obstacles look larger, makes solutions look smaller, makes your capabilities appear insufficient. The mind under fear cannot think objectively, cannot assess accurately, cannot see clearly, because fear is distortion. It warps perception, makes you see threat where none exists, makes you miss opportunities that are present, makes you doubt abilities you actually possess. And most people, when pressure rises, allow fear to dominate their thinking completely. They don't even realize it's happening. They just experience the distorted perceptions and believe them to be reality. Third, emotional turbulence increases. Anxiety, frustration, anger, doubt. Whatever emotions you haven't learned to regulate, pressure amplifies them. And emotions, when uncontrolled, flood the thinking mind. They don't add to thinking. They replace thinking. You stop reasoning and start reacting. Stop analyzing and start assuming. Stop considering carefully and start acting impulsively, because emotion, when it dominates, shuts down the higher functions of mind, the parts that create clear judgment, strategic thinking, wise decision-making. All of this goes offline when emotion takes over. And pressure, for most people, triggers exactly this takeover. This is why pressure reveals rather than creates weakness. If your mental habits are undisciplined in low-pressure situations, they'll be catastrophically undisciplined in high-pressure situations. If you can't regulate emotion when stakes are low, you certainly can't when stakes are high. If you can't control your internal dialogue when time is abundant, you definitely can't when time is scarce. Pressure doesn't create these problems. It exposes them. It takes whatever mental habits you've been practicing unconsciously and amplifies them. And for most people, those habits are terrible, reactive, emotional, scattered, unclear. So when pressure rises, these habits produce exactly what you'd expect: confusion, poor decisions, paralysis, panic. But here's the critical insight. If pressure amplifies existing habits, then the solution is not to handle pressure better. The solution is to build better habits before pressure arrives, to train your mind during calm moments so that when pressure comes, your trained responses activate instead of your default reactions. This is how clarity under pressure is actually created, not in the moment of pressure, but in the thousands of moments before pressure arrives, through deliberate mental conditioning that establishes patterns of clear thinking so deeply that they persist even when circumstances become extreme. Think about this carefully. Every moment of your life, you're training your mind. You're establishing patterns, habits of thought, habits of emotional response, habits of perception and interpretation. Most people do this unconsciously. They let their minds run on autopilot. They react to circumstances automatically. They allow emotions to come and go without direction. They think whatever thoughts arise without examination. And through this unconscious process, they're training mental habits. Habits of reactivity, of emotional volatility, of unclear thinking. So when pressure arrives, these are the habits that activate, and they produce the predictable result: mental collapse. But you can train differently. You can condition your mind deliberately. You can establish habits of clarity, of emotional regulation, of controlled response, of objective perception. And when you do this, when you train these patterns during calm moments, they become your default, your automatic response. So when pressure rises, instead of clarity disappearing, it remains steady, reliable, present exactly when you need it most. This is the secret. This is what separates those who think clearly under pressure from those who collapse. Not superior genetics, not lucky circumstances, but deliberate training that most people never undertake because they don't understand how essential it is. So how does this training work? How do you actually condition your mind to remain clear when pressure increases? Let me show you exactly what trained minds do differently and how you can develop the same capacity. The foundation of clarity under pressure is emotional regulation. This is not about suppressing emotion. This is about preventing emotion from controlling your thinking. Emotion will arise when pressure increases. This is natural, unavoidable. The question is not whether you'll feel emotion. The question is whether emotion will dominate your mind, or whether you'll observe emotion while maintaining clear thinking. These are completely different states, and the difference between them is everything. Most people identify with their emotions. When fear arises, they become fear. When anxiety appears, they become anxious. There's no separation between the emotion and their sense of self. So the emotion floods their entire consciousness, takes over their thinking, determines their actions. But trained minds operate differently. They observe emotion without becoming it. They notice fear arising and think, there's fear, without thinking, I am afraid. This distinction seems subtle, but it's profound. Because when you can observe emotion without identifying with it, the emotion loses its power to control you. It's present. You feel it, but it doesn't determine your thinking or actions. You remain clear despite the emotion. And this clarity allows you to make wise decisions, even when feeling things that would paralyze others. This capacity for emotional observation is trained through daily practice, not when pressure is high, when pressure is low. Throughout your normal day, you experience countless small emotions: irritations, desire, aversion. Most people react to these automatically, but you can practice observing them instead. When irritation arises, notice it. Name it. There's irritation. Feel it without acting on it. This simple practice, repeated hundreds of times with small emotions, trains the capacity to observe rather than be controlled by emotion. And this capacity, once trained with small emotions, works with large emotions too. With fear, with anger, with anxiety, you can feel them fully while thinking clearly, because you've trained the ability to separate feeling from thinking, to experience emotion without letting emotion dominate consciousness. But emotional regulation alone is not enough. You must also train the opposite of what pressure naturally creates. You must train slowness, not physical slowness, mental slowness, the ability to slow your thinking down even when everything around you speeds up. This sounds counterintuitive. When pressure rises, when urgency increases, your instinct is to think faster, to move faster, to decide faster. But speed destroys clarity. Clear thinking requires careful consideration, accurate perception, wise judgment, none of which are possible when your mind is racing. So the trained mind does the opposite of what instinct suggests. It slows down, deliberately, consciously, even when, especially when, circumstances demand speed. This mental slowing is not procrastination. It's not delay. It's the deliberate choice to think carefully instead of reacting quickly. And here's what's remarkable. When you slow your thinking down, when you take the time to perceive accurately and consider carefully, you actually become more effective, not less. Because clear thinking, even if slightly slower, produces better decisions than confused thinking, even if faster. And better decisions produce better outcomes. So by slowing down internally, you speed up your results. You waste less time on wrong choices, on actions born from panic rather than clarity. You see solutions others miss because they're moving too quickly to see clearly. But slowing the mind is difficult. It requires practice. And the practice must happen before pressure arrives. Throughout your normal day, practice slowing your mental pace. When you feel rushed, deliberately pause. Take a full breath. Let your mind settle before proceeding. When you're about to make a decision, resist the urge to decide instantly. Pause. Consider. Think it through. Not laboriously, but carefully. This practice, repeated daily in low-stakes situations, builds the capacity to slow your thinking deliberately. And this capacity transfers to high-stakes situations. When pressure is extreme, you can activate this trained slowness, can pause when instinct screams to rush, can think when others panic. And this ability to maintain mental slowness when external pace accelerates, this is what creates extraordinary clarity under pressure. Closely related to this is the skill of separating facts from fear. Under pressure, your mind generates thoughts rapidly. Many of these thoughts are not facts. They're interpretations, assumptions, projections based on fear rather than reality. But in the moment, they feel like facts. They feel true. And if you believe them, if you act on them, you'll make decisions based on distortion rather than reality. So trained minds have learned to distinguish between what's actually true and what merely feels true, between objective facts and subjective fears. This distinction is critical. When pressure rises, observe your thoughts. Notice what you're telling yourself. Is it fact or interpretation? Fact is what actually happened, what can be observed, what's demonstrably true. Interpretation is the story you're adding to the facts, the meaning you're assigning, the conclusions you're drawing. Most people don't separate these. They experience their interpretations as facts. So their thinking is based on distortion from the beginning. But if you practice separating facts from interpretations, if you ask yourself constantly, what actually happened versus what am I telling myself it means, you gain the ability to think from reality rather than from fear. And thinking from reality produces clear judgment, while thinking from fear produces confusion and poor decisions. Train this daily. When you have a thought that feels negative or frightening, Examine, is this thought based on what actually happened, or is it based on what I'm afraid might happen? Is this observation or projection? Is this fact or story? This practice of distinguishing fact from fear, when done consistently, trains your mind to default to reality rather than to assumption. And this default remains even under pressure. When others are basing decisions on fear and assumption, you're basing decisions on what's actually true. And this gives you an enormous advantage, because reality, not fear, is what determines outcomes. Another essential skill is control of internal dialogue. Your mind talks to itself constantly. This dialogue shapes everything: your emotional state, your confidence, your perception of circumstances, your sense of capability. And most people's internal dialogue, especially under pressure, is destructive. It's critical, doubtful, catastrophic. It tells them they can't handle it, that things will go wrong, that they're not capable. And this dialogue, believed and repeated, creates the very outcomes it describes, not through mysticism, through the simple fact that what you tell yourself determines how you feel and act. And how you feel and act determines results. So trained minds take control of this dialogue. They direct it deliberately. They notice destructive self-talk and replace it, not with false optimism, not with denial of reality, but with accurate, supportive dialogue. When the mind says you can't do this, they counter with what is actually true. I've handled difficult situations before. I have the capacity to figure this out. I can think clearly regardless of pressure. These statements aren't lies, they're truth. And repeating truth rather than fear changes everything, because supportive self-dialogue creates supportive emotional states, and supportive emotional states enable clear thinking and effective action. Practice this now. Listen to how you talk to yourself throughout the day. Is the dialogue supportive or critical? Accurate or distorted? When you notice critical or fearful self-talk, pause. Replace it consciously with something true and supportive. Not fake, not pretending everything is perfect, just accurate. This practice, maintained consistently, retrains your habitual internal dialogue, and when pressure rises, this trained dialogue activates automatically. Your mind supports instead of sabotages, encourages instead of doubts, and this internal support makes all the difference in maintaining clarity when circumstances are extreme. Equally important is the ability to maintain perspective. Under pressure, everything feels immediate, urgent, like this moment is all that matters. And this collapsed time perspective intensifies pressure dramatically. But trained minds maintain broader perspective. They can zoom out, can see this moment in context of longer time frames, can recognize that what feels catastrophic right now will be insignificant in a week, a month, a year. This perspective doesn't diminish the importance of the moment. It prevents the moment from becoming overwhelming. It keeps pressure in proportion to reality rather than amplifying it through collapsed perspective. When you face pressure, practice zooming out. Ask yourself, how important will this be in a year, in 5 years? Often, the answer reveals that the stakes are not as extreme as they feel in the moment. And this recognition immediately reduces the sense of pressure. Not because you stop caring, but because you see accurately rather than through the distorted lens of collapsed time perspective. This practice of maintaining broad perspective, of seeing moments in context rather than isolation, it's trained through daily use. Throughout your day, practice asking, how important is this really? Will this matter tomorrow, next week, next year? And let the answer recalibrate your sense of urgency and importance. This trained perspective protects you from the distortion of collapsed time, keeps you clear even when circumstances feel urgent. Now, all of these skills, emotional regulation, mental slowing, fact versus fear distinction, controlled internal dialogue, maintain perspective, they all support the ultimate skill, the ability to make decisions without panic. Because ultimately, pressure tests your decision-making capacity. And decision-making under pressure is where most people fail catastrophically. They either freeze unable to decide at all, or they decide rashly, acting on impulse rather than judgment. Both produce poor outcomes, but trained minds do neither. They maintain the capacity to decide clearly, to consider options calmly, to choose wisely, even when time is limited and stakes are high. This capacity is built through understanding that decision-making has a process, and that process can be maintained even under pressure if you've practiced it enough. The process is simple. First, clarify exactly what decision needs to be made. This seems obvious, but most people, especially under pressure, aren't clear about what they're actually deciding. They feel overwhelmed by the entire situation rather than focusing on the specific choice point. So first, define the decision clearly. What exactly am I choosing between? This clarity immediately reduces overwhelm. Second, identify your actual options, not infinite possibilities. Your actual, realistic options in this situation. Usually there are fewer than you think. 2 options. 3 at most. Write them down if possible. See them clearly. This limits mental noise, gives you something specific to evaluate rather than spinning in vague anxiety about the situation. Third, consider each option briefly, not exhaustively, but adequately. What would happen if I chose this? What are the likely consequences? The key is brief consideration, not analysis paralysis, not endless rumination. Just clear, focused thought about each option's probable outcomes. This can happen quickly, in seconds or minutes, depending on situation. But it must happen. You cannot decide wisely without considering consequences. Fourth, choose, not tentatively, decisively. Based on your consideration, select the option that seems best, not perfect, best available. And once you choose, commit. Don't second guess. Don't wish you had chosen differently. Commit fully to executing the decision you made, because a good decision executed completely is better than a perfect decision executed half-heartedly. This process, practiced in low-stakes situations daily, becomes automatic. You can execute it rapidly under pressure because you've done it thousands of times when pressure was absent. So when high-stakes decisions arrive, you don't freeze. You don't panic. You activate your trained process, clarify the decision, identify options, consider briefly, choose decisively, commit fully. And this process, simple as it is, produces vastly better outcomes than the panic and paralysis most people experience under decision pressure. But here's what most people never understand. All of this training, all of these skills, they must be practiced before pressure arrives. You cannot develop clarity under pressure by waiting until pressure appears and then trying to be clear. That's backwards. Pressure reveals what you've already trained. If you've trained scattered thinking, pressure reveals scattered thinking. If you've trained emotional reactivity, pressure reveals emotional reactivity. But if you've trained clarity, emotional regulation, controlled response, clear decision-making, then pressure reveals all of that instead. Pressure doesn't create your capabilities. It exposes them. So the work must happen before pressure arrives. In normal moments, in daily practice, in consistent conditioning of mental habits that will serve you when stakes are highest. This is the realization that changes everything. Pressure is not your enemy. Pressure is your test. It tests what you've built, what you've trained, what you've become. And if you've done the work, if you've conditioned your mind deliberately, pressure becomes the moment when you demonstrate your greatest strength. Not because pressure made you strong, but because pressure revealed the strength you'd been building all along. This is why some people seem to thrive under pressure. They're not different from you fundamentally. They simply trained differently. They built mental capacity during calm moments, and when pressure arrived, that capacity activated. Appeared effortless, but it wasn't effortless. It was the result of tremendous effort invested before the pressure appeared. So here's your path forward. Here's how you begin conditioning your mind to remain clear under pressure. Not through dramatic intervention, through consistent daily practice, through small disciplines repeated until they become automatic, through conditioning that most people never undertake because they don't see its value until pressure arrives and they don't have it. Start each day with deliberate mental preparation. Before engaging with the world, before pressure has any chance to arrive, sit quietly for a few minutes, not meditating necessarily, just sitting in silence. And practice observing your thoughts without controlling them. Just watch them arise and pass. Notice how they come from nowhere, how they lead to other thoughts, how they trigger emotions. This practice of observing thought without being controlled by thought, it's foundational. It creates the separation between you and your thinking that allows you to remain clear even when thinking becomes turbulent under pressure. Do this daily. Even 5 minutes, just sitting, observing, not trying to stop thinking, not trying to force calm, just observing what's happening in your mind. This simple practice, maintained consistently, trains the observer, the part of you that can watch thinking without being thinking. And this observer is what maintains clarity under pressure, because it can observe fear without becoming fearful, can observe panic without panicking, can observe pressure without being pressured. This separation, this observer capacity, it's developed through daily practice of simply watching your mind operate. Throughout your day, practice emotional regulation with small emotions. When irritation arises over something minor, notice it, name it, feel it without acting on it. When impatience appears in traffic or in line, observe it. Experience it fully, but don't let it control your actions. This practice with small emotions trains the capacity to regulate large emotions, because the skill is the same. Observe without identifying, feel without being controlled, and the more you practice with minor emotions, the more automatic this skill becomes. So when major emotions arise under pressure, the skill activates. You can feel intense fear or anxiety while thinking clearly, because you've trained the separation between feeling and thinking. Practice slowing your mental pace deliberately. When you feel rush, pause, take 3 full breaths, let your mind settle, then proceed calmly. Do this constantly. Make it your response to any sense of urgency. Not denial of urgency, but refusal to let urgency create mental chaos. This trained slowness, this ability to remain mentally calm, even when external pace is fast, it transfers directly to high-pressure situations. You'll be able to maintain clear thinking while others are panicking simply because you've trained your mind to remain slow and steady regardless of external pace. Practice distinguishing fact from interpretation in every situation. When something happens that triggers emotion, pause. Ask yourself, what actually happened? Not what I think it means, not what I'm afraid it means. What actually objectively happened? Then ask, what am I adding to that fact? What story am I telling myself? This practice of separating observation from interpretation, fact from fear, it trains your mind to default to reality. And thinking from reality rather than from fear is what creates clear judgment under pressure. Control your internal dialogue actively. Throughout the day, listen to how you talk to yourself. When you notice critical, fearful, or catastrophic self-talk, interrupt it. Replace it with something accurate and supportive, not fake positivity, just truth. I can handle this. I've dealt with difficult things before. I have the capacity to figure this out. These true, supportive statements repeated consistently retrain your habitual self-talk, and this trained dialogue supports you automatically when pressure rises. Your mind becomes your ally rather than your saboteur. Practice maintaining perspective constantly. When something feels urgent or important, zoom out. Ask, how important will this be next week, next month, next year? Let the answer recalibrate your sense of urgency. This doesn't mean nothing matters. It means keeping things in proportion, preventing collapse time perspective from amplifying pressure artificially. This trained perspective protects you from overwhelm, keeps you clear even when circumstances feel intense, and practice decision-making deliberately. Don't just decide automatically. Notice when decisions arise. Pause, clarify exactly what you're deciding. Identify your options clearly. Consider each briefly. Choose decisively. Commit fully. Do this with small decisions all day. What to eat, what to work on first, how to respond to an email. Make each decision a practice of your process. And through hundreds of small practices, the process becomes automatic. So when high-stakes decisions arrive under pressure, your trained process activates. You can decide clearly and quickly because you've practiced the skill constantly in low-stakes situations. All of this practice, all of this conditioning, it seems like a lot, but it's not. It's simply bringing consciousness to what you're already doing. You're already thinking, already feeling emotions, already making decisions. The only difference is doing these things deliberately instead of automatically, consciously instead of reactively. And through this shift from automatic to deliberate, you train patterns that serve you under pressure rather than patterns that collapse under pressure. This is not quick work. This is not a technique you learn in a weekend and master. This is conditioning, like physical conditioning. It requires consistent practice over time. But the results are extraordinary, because every moment you invest in this training compounds. Each day of practice makes the next day easier. Each successful emotional regulation strengthens the capacity for the next. Each decision made through your process reinforces the pattern, and over weeks and months, these trained patterns become your default, your automatic response. So when pressure arrives, you don't have to try to be clear. You simply are clear, because clarity is what you trained. And here's what happens then. Pressure, instead of being something you fear, becomes something you use. It becomes the moment when you demonstrate capacity, when you show what you've built, when you execute with precision while others are collapsing. This doesn't make you arrogant. It makes you reliable, dependable, someone who can be trusted when stakes are highest. And this reliability creates opportunities, responsibilities, leadership, because everyone is looking for people who can think clearly under pressure, who can make good decisions when chaos surrounds them, who can remain steady when others panic. These people are rare, valuable, and you can become one of them through deliberate training of mental skills that most people leave completely untrained. So understand this. Pressure is inevitable. You cannot avoid it. As long as you're pursuing anything meaningful, as long as you're taking responsibility, as long as you're competing or leading or creating, pressure will be present, sometimes extreme. This is not a problem. This is reality. The question is not whether you'll face pressure. The question is whether you'll think clearly when you do, whether you'll maintain judgment when others lose it, whether you'll decide wisely when circumstances are chaotic. And that question is answered not in the moment of pressure, but in the 1,000 moments before pressure arrives, in the daily training, in the consistent conditioning, in the deliberate building of mental capacity that will serve you when you need it most. You are conditioning your mind right now, whether you realize it or not, through every thought you allow, every emotion you indulge, every response you make. You're training patterns. The only question is whether you're training deliberately or accidentally, whether you're building capacity or reinforcing limitation, whether you're preparing for pressure or guaranteeing collapse. This choice, this daily choice of how to condition your mind, this determines everything, not your circumstances, not your challenges, your conditioning, your training, your preparation. So decide now, will you train your mind deliberately? Will you practice emotional regulation, mental slowness, fact versus fear distinction, controlled dialogue, maintained perspective, clear decision making? Will you do this daily, consistently, with the understanding that you're building capacity for moments of extreme pressure? Or will you leave your mind untrained, reactive, at the mercy of circumstances? One path leads to clarity under pressure. The other leads to collapse. And the path is chosen not once but daily, through small practices, through consistent disciplines, through the decision to train deliberately rather than react automatically. Pressure does not create weakness. It reveals training. And if you train clarity, pressure reveals clarity. If you train emotional regulation, pressure reveals regulation. If you train wise decision-making, pressure reveals wisdom. You become under pressure exactly what you've been practicing before pressure arrived. Nothing more, nothing less. So practice what you want to be. Practice clarity. Practice steadiness. Practice control. And when pressure comes, and it will come, you'll find that confusion is optional. That panic is a choice. That collapse is not inevitable. You'll find that you can think clearly, can act decisively, can maintain absolute mental control when everyone around you is losing theirs, not because you're special, but because you trained. And training, applied consistently over time, produces capacity that looks like magic to those who never trained at all. But to you, it's simply the result of work done before the moment arrived. of preparation meeting opportunity, of trained capacity activating under the exact conditions you prepared for. This is your advantage. This is your path forward. Not hoping pressure will be kind, but training yourself to be clear regardless of pressure. Not wishing for easy circumstances, but building the capacity to think straight in difficult circumstances. Not depending on luck or perfect conditions, but developing mental discipline that works in any condition. This discipline, this training, this capacity, it's available to you, starting now, through consistent practice, through daily conditioning, through the decision to master your mind instead of being mastered by circumstances. Make that decision. Begin that training. And discover that you're capable of far more than you believed. That pressure, instead of being your enemy, becomes your proof. The moment when you demonstrate exactly what you trained yourself to become. Clear, steady, decisive, unshaken, no matter what.